Today I have the honor to be able to interview one of my heroes of the faith, Dr. William Lane Craig. And if you're not familiar with him, he is probably the world's most famous and renowned Christian philosopher and apologist. He has 2 PhDs, one in philosophy, one in theology. He's debated pretty much every well-known atheist that there is, everyone from Christopher Hitchens to Sam Harris. He's been on Ben Shapiro's Sunday Special. He's been in conversations with Jordan Peterson. And so today we get to hear from him on some of the reasons why we believe in God and in the resurrection of Jesus. All right, well, I am here with Dr. Craig, and I'm so excited because he is one of my heroes of the faith, and I have learned so much from him over the years through all of his debates and his writings and videos, and so I'm just very, very excited to be able to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Cody. It's good to be with you.
Good. Well, hey, I wanted to jump in and talk through, I know that you have written a lot about God's existence and the reasons to believe that God exists. And so I was just wondering if we could go through maybe a handful of those arguments. And we don't have to go in incredible depth or anything, but maybe just start to talk through some of those arguments.
Great. Let me just list the arguments that I have defended in my published work to get us started. First, I've argued that God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists, rather than nothing. Secondly, God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe at a time in the finite past. Thirdly, God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent, embodied life. Fourth, God is the best explanation for the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. Fifth, God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties in the world. And finally, the very possibility of God's existence implies that God exists. Those, I think, constitute a powerful cumulative case for the existence of God.
Okay, so could we just maybe go through and give a rough sketch of each one of those, and maybe along the way I can ask just a couple questions of clarification and maybe some popular objections that I've heard.
Okay, the first one was that God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists rather than nothing. And this argument can be simply formulated as follows. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in terms of the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Second premise is that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And the third premise is that the universe exists. Now, from those 3 premises, it follows that the explanation for the existence of the universe is God. So if those 3 premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows.
Okay, and so you use 2 different kind of lines of evidence, scientific and philosophical, is that right?
That's more pertinent to the second argument, Cody, the one based on the beginning of the universe. This argument is really purely philosophical or metaphysical in nature rather than scientific.
Okay, so maybe we should go to the second one then, the beginning of the universe.
Okay, this one is even more simply formulated. It goes like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, from which it follows that 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. And then you unpack conceptually what it is to be a cause of the universe, and a number of striking theological properties of this first uncaused cause emerge from such an analysis.
So, and that's where you get the philosophical and the scientific evidence that supports that argument. Is that correct?
Yes, particularly with respect to the second premise that the universe began to exist. This is the really crucial premise in the argument. And it's supported both by philosophical arguments against the infinity of the past, as well as contemporary scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe.
Okay, so you give a couple of great illustrations. So one would be, a typical watcher right now would probably be thinking of Big Bang cosmology, right? And
Yes.
so that's the scientific line of evidence that you
That
use.
would be one of the two scientific lines of evidence.
What was the second?
The thermodynamic properties of the universe. Both of these factors point to the finitude of the universe in the past and an absolute beginning.
Okay. And then the other is a philosophical argument for an infinite regress. Is that right?
I give two philosophical arguments against the infinitude of the past. One would be based on the impossibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things.
Okay.
And then the second argument would be the impossibility of forming a collection of an actually infinite number of things by adding one member at a time.
Okay. So you give a great example of this. It's a Hilbert's Hotel
Yes.
that you talk about and how an actual infinite can't exist. Could you just walk us through that really quick?
Sure. Hilbert's Hotel is the brainchild of the great German mathematician David Hilbert, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. To warm up, first let's imagine an ordinary hotel with a finite number of rooms. And let's suppose that all the rooms are occupied. There is not a single vacancy throughout the entire hotel. If a new guest shows up at the front desk asking for a room, the manager says, sorry, all the rooms are full, and the new guest is turned away. But now, Hilbert said, let's imagine a hotel which has an infinite number of rooms. And let's suppose once more that all the rooms are occupied. Every room in this hotel has a real flesh and blood person staying in it. Now, says Hilbert, let's imagine what happens when a new guest shows up at the front desk asking for a room. Of course, says the manager. And he shifts the person who was staying in room 1 into room 2. The person who was in room 2 into room 3. The person who was in room 3 into room 4, and so on out to infinity. As a result of these transpositions, room number 1 now becomes vacant, and the new guest gratefully checks in. And yet, before he arrived, all the rooms were already full. Now, if that seems strange, it gets even worse. Let's imagine now, Hilbert says, that an infinite number of new guests show up at the front desk asking for rooms. Of course, says the manager. And he shifts the person who was in room 1 into room 2. The person who was in room 2 into room 4. The person who was in room 3 into room 6. The person in room 4 into room 8. Every person into the room number double his own. Well, since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all of the guests wind up in the even numbered rooms, and all of the odd numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests is easily accommodated. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. Can such a hotel really exist? I don't think so. It's metaphysically absurd.
And so if you apply the same concept to the infinitude of the past,
Yes.
there could not be an infinite amount of events that have resulted in today. Is that?
Yes. If the universe is truly beginningless and the series of past events never had a beginning, then there has transpired prior to today an actually infinite number of events.
Yeah.
And since there's nothing in Hilbert's use of a hotel that hangs on its being about a hotel building, this same general absurdity would apply to the infinitude of the past as well.
Okay, so that's the philosophical side of it, that there can't be this infinite.
That's one of the philosophical arguments
right,
in support of a beginning, yes.
Okay, and then when it comes to the scientific arguments, and I know we don't have time to unpack all of these. This could be hours long if we did.
Sure.
But just for maybe a popular level audience, people like myself, is you point to what everybody would probably be familiar with, which is in a textbook, which is about the Big Bang cosmology and
yes,
the Earth.
That's right. I think that most people don't understand that according to the Big Bang theory, the expansion of the universe goes back to a point before which nothing existed. It is not only the beginning of all matter and energy, it is the beginning of physical space and time themselves. So that on the Big Bang model, the universe is finite in the past and has an absolute origin that is not preceded by anything.
So I know that there's different models that people are suggesting, and nothing has really kind of gained in popularity. But are there any models that you see that are emerging that would defeat this argument? So like, oscillating universes and things like that. Do you see anything on the horizon?
No, the history of 20th century cosmology has been a history of the failed attempt to refute the prediction of the standard model of a beginning of the universe. And alternative models, such as steady state theory, oscillating models, vacuum fluctuation models, inflationary models, quantum gravity models, have come and gone as in every case, the attempt to craft a model that is beginningless has been shown to be either mathematically inconsistent or empirically untenable. In the words of Alexander Vilenkin, who is one of the most eminent of contemporary cosmologists, these results seem to show that a beginningless model of the universe cannot be formulated successfully.
So from a Christian perspective, this makes sense because it aligns with Genesis. And so we get that. But there is a part of it that makes some Christians feel uncomfortable. Well, one, just the phrase Big Bang kind of freaks them out a little bit. But you point out that, no, this is actually a pointer to Genesis and the account that there. But the other part is the age of the universe, the age of the earth, and what seems to be not only an enormous amount of time, but space that, like, the more that we learn about the universe, the bigger it becomes. And so it's sort of hard to reconcile Genesis with this creation account, but it being, almost 14 billion years ago. How do you reconcile? I know you're doing a lot of work on that right now. How do you understand that within the Genesis account?
Yeah, I think that it's really great that contemporary evangelicals are shedding this young earth creationist view that says the universe was created 6 to 10,000 years ago. That viewpoint is not incumbent upon a biblically faithful Christian reader of Genesis. And I think the wide majority of evangelicals would take non-literal approaches to Genesis that would say we're not obligated to believe the universe was created a few thousand years ago. In terms of the scientific evidence, young earth creationism is simply indefensible. It's not only in conflict with evolutionary biology, which is the sort of bête noire of young earthers, but it's contrary to astrophysics, to geology, to archaeology, to linguistics, to history. It's really an indefensible point of view. So we'd better hope that Genesis doesn't oblige us to interpret this in a literal way to mean the world came into being a few thousand years ago.
So, okay, I got a couple of questions that I get on a regular basis. One would be, why couldn't God have created the universe to look as if it's old, kind of like we see in the creation account with Adam and Eve? We see that they were created as fully formed adults, well, why isn't the universe in that same category where it's fully formed and has the perception of age, but not necessarily is that age?
There's no way to refute that philosophically or scientifically. God could have created the universe 5 minutes ago with built-in appearances of age, food in our stomachs from the breakfast we never really ate. You never really married your wife. This is all an illusion with the appearance of age. And that kind of argument, as you can see, it just knows no stopping point. And I think that's what's wrong with it. It leads to complete skepticism about our perceptions and knowledge of the external world for no good reason. So if we can avoid something so radical as the appearance of age, that would be a great benefit, I think. Besides, that view makes God a deceiver. And for that reason, I don't think young earthers adopt this point of view. I've seen young earth creationists themselves say we must not appeal to apparent age, because this turns God into a deceiver, which is not compatible with his moral character.
Yeah. So some people have a tough time with kind of the age of the earth for other reasons. One would be, and I know that you're working on this right now, is historical Adam and Eve, evolution. How does that fit into the big picture? That kind of has been seen as heretical in some churches for a while, is to believe in evolution so how do you, I know you're working on that.
I think, Cody, once you give up the view that the world was created in 6 consecutive 24-hour days a few thousand years ago, then the Genesis narrative says nothing about how God brought into existence these various plant and animal life forms. In fact, it's so interesting when he creates the plants and the animals, God doesn't just create them miraculously out of nothing. The Genesis account says, and God said, let the earth bring forth plants bearing seed after their kind and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind. And it was so. The earth brought forth these plants. And similarly, with respect to the animals, it says, God says, let the earth bring forth animals after their kinds. So in the narrative itself, it suggests that there could be natural means which God employed in order to make the plant and animal life on this planet.
So you've said recently that you kind of put modern humans and potentially Adam and Eve now a few 100,000 years ago. Is that
yes.
what you're currently thinking?
Yes, it is. I have tried to look at the scientific evidence for when human beings originated on this planet. And I think the key to answering that question is whether we think Neanderthals were human. And increasingly, the opinion among paleoanthropologists is that Neanderthals exhibited a cognitive capacity and cognitive behavior which is comparable to that of modern human beings, so that it would be prejudicial to try to write them out of the human race and say they weren't really human. Well, if Adam and Eve are the ancestors of all human beings, that means they need to be the ancestors of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And so that would put them back somewhere prior to 500,000 years ago or so, where they could be the common ancestor from which every human being came.
Yeah, so many people hearing this is going to be the first time that they're hearing something like this, maybe because they haven't thought of it very much, or the church that they grew up in, or whatever, for whatever reason, this is going to be kind of startling. And so a lot of questions will start to kind of emerge in their minds, which is like, first of all, what about all the genealogies in Genesis then? Like 500,000 years is a long time, and the genealogies then would have to span that amount of time, but that obviously isn't happening if you translate them literally and sequentially. And how do you reconcile that?
This gets into a critical issue of the genre of Genesis 1 to 11. A genre means a literary type, what type of literature it is. For example, the Psalms belong to the genre of poetry. The book of Revelation belongs to the genre of Jewish apocalyptic literature. Now, neither of those two types of literature should be taken literally. When the psalmist says, "Let the trees of the wood clap their hands before the Lord," he's not teaching botany. When the book of Revelation says this multi-headed monster is going to crawl up out of the ocean and try to take over the world, it's not taken literally. It's symbolic of alliances of nation states and political rulers. And I would argue, when you look at Genesis 1 to 11, that this is not of the genre of literal history. I think that begins with the call of Abraham in chapter 12. Rather, there are quite a few literary markers that suggest that Genesis 1 to 11 should be classified as what has been called mytho-history. That is to say, it does concern genuine historical people and events, but it is cloaked with the figurative language characteristic of mythology. And if that is the case, then these genealogies do show a historical interest. Yes, these are real historical people, but we shouldn't press them for literal significance, like trying to add up the ages of the patriarchs to calculate when the world was created.
Okay. One of the issues that I struggle with when it comes to evolution is, looking at the archaeology, and that all makes sense. The problem that I have is, what do you do with the incredible amount of suffering that took place over all of those years, specifically animal suffering, in order for a species to evolve and arrive and survive. And it just seems like that's not only wasteful, but it's painful. And if that's the way that God designed it from the beginning, that seems to be, I don't know, there seems to be something off about that.
Okay, man, you really picked a big question.
I know, I apologize. You just kind of started snowballing, and I was going to go through your arguments, but there's so many that are intertwined in this that I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to come at you. And
they are intertwined. Okay, well, let me say a few things about this in a soundbite-ish way. First, there's nothing in the Bible that indicates that animal death and predation is the result of the fall. This is a myth of young earth creationists in the negative sense of that word. They're reading this in between the lines. There's nothing to suggest that there was not animal death prior to man's fall, and animal death is not included in Genesis 3 among the curses on the primordial pair, nor in Romans 5, where Paul talks about spiritual death coming into the world through Adam. Secondly, animals do not have the sort of self-awareness that human beings do. That is to say, when I am in pain, I have an awareness of myself such that I can say, I am in pain. Animals don't seem to have this sort of self-conscious grasp of themselves as themselves. So that even though animals are in pain, they don't know that they're in pain. They do not think, I am in pain. And therefore, animal suffering is qualitatively different from human suffering. We have a tendency toward what's called anthropopathism. That is, we project onto Bambi and Thumper human feelings and emotions that are entirely inappropriate. In fact, a lot of animals are just like little machines, insects, for example, and worms and so forth. When you get to the higher animals, the sentient animals, they do have pain experience, but they don't have self-awareness. And so they're not aware that they are in pain. And I think that really, really mitigates the problem of pain significantly. Finally, the third thing I would say is that God knows that by allowing these eons of animal suffering, that he has created an arena in which the human drama will be played out, which has as its ultimate goal bringing the optimal number of people freely into his kingdom and an eternal saving relationship with himself, so that a world that features this preamble to the introduction of human beings into this arena is a better world than a world that did not feature it. It's all subordinated to God's ultimate purpose of bringing men and women freely into his kingdom.
Good. Okay, so I could spend all day on this. We'll have to go to the next the next one so we can get through more of the arguments. So I think is the fine tuning, is that the next one?
Yes, the fine tuning argument was the next one. It goes like this. The fine tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, it is not due to physical necessity or to chance, from which it follows 3, therefore it is due to design. Now, in order to grasp this argument, we have to understand what fine-tuning is. Fine-tuning refers to the fundamental constants and quantities of nature that take on values that fall within an exquisitely narrow life-permitting range. For all practical purposes, infinitesimal. If the values of these constants and quantities were to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the universe would be life prohibiting. So if you were to throw a random dart at the tableau of possible values these constants and quantities could have, in all probability, it would strike a life prohibiting universe rather than landing in this incomprehensibly narrow life-permitting range. And so the question is, how do you best explain the fact that our universe is fine-tuned in such a way? And the argument will be that of the available explanations today, design is the most plausible.
And so the pushback would be, and it seems to be gaining popularity, is the multiverse. Is
yes.
If there's, an infinite amount of universes like ours, then anything really is going to happen. All of those,
right?
All those constants and constants are going to eventually take place somewhere.
Somewhere in the multiverse, yes. Now, the multiverse hypothesis is a kind of backhanded compliment to the design hypothesis, because its proponents admit that if you just consider our universe, the odds that it would be life permitting are prohibitive. They are infinitesimal. And so in order to rescue the hypothesis of chance, they resort to this remarkable metaphysical hypothesis that there is an array of universes constituting a sort of world ensemble, and moreover, that the universes in this array are infinite in number and randomly ordered in their constants and quantities. There is no evidence at all for any of those hypotheses. So this is a radical metaphysical hypothesis that is opposed to theism as an explanation of the fine-tuning. And this is where the debate is today, as you say.
Yeah, I've been hearing more and more as I follow the debate is there seems to be more and more scientists that believe in the multiverse. Now, they would say it's because that's where the evidence is pointing, but you would push back and say, no, I think it's more metaphysical that's pushing in there. They would say that there's, and I want to say, is it Roger Penrose that was pushing this? I can't remember recently.
Actually, no. Penrose is one of the skeptics about using the multiverse to explain fine-tuning. He has provided, I think, one of the most powerful arguments in the literature against using the multiverse to explain fine-tuning. So I would disagree, Cody, that more and more scientists are opting for the multiverse. I think that they are well aware of its problems, and many are skeptical. And secondly, those who do opt for it do not do so because of the evidence. It's because this is the only resort to explain the fine tuning without resorting to a designer. It's got to be either physical necessity, chance, or design. Physical necessity won't work, so you got to appeal to chance. But the odds against it are too prohibitive if there's only one universe. So to multiply your probabilistic resources, you go for the multiverse hypothesis. So this is a metaphysical hypothesis akin to theism. It's like postulating the existence of God, a metaphysical hypothesis to explain the fine tuning. And the question will be then, which of these metaphysical hypotheses, theism, that is, say, designer, or multiverse, is the most plausible?
Right. And even if there were a multiverse, it just pushes the problem back one more step, which is, you have to have some kind of design element in order for it to produce these kinds of universes and things. So it doesn't really solve an issue. It just kind of pushes it back.
It's it upstairs. That's exactly right, Cody, because if the multiverse itself requires fine tuning, you haven't solved anything by appeal to the multiverse.
Right. Okay. Okay, great. So let's see. The next argument, is it the applicability of mathematics?
Yes. This is a new argument that I've been working on. We have animated videos on all of the other arguments that I've mentioned available at our website, reasonablefaith.org. And we are just now finishing up the animated video on this argument from the applicability of mathematics. So it will be available soon. It goes like this. Premise one, if God does not exist, then the applicability of mathematics to the physical world is just a happy coincidence. Premise two, the applicability of mathematics to the physical world is not just a happy coincidence, from which it follows three, therefore God exists.
Okay, and so what you're talking about here is how you can sit there with a piece of paper, do certain mathematical formulas, and then it actually predicts what's out in the universe.
Exactly. These theoretical physicists using complex mathematical formulas that seemingly have nothing to do with physical reality, as you say, accurately describe the way the universe works and can help us to predict results in the future that can then be experimentally verified. So as Galileo said, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics.
Good. Okay, and then is the next argument the moral argument?
Yes. The moral argument basically goes like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two, but objective moral values and duties do exist, from which it follows three, therefore God exists.
And so this one is probably the most accessible for people because this one hits right at home, right? Is they experience moral values and duties on a daily basis. And so certain things are right and wrong. And that's really what you're talking about. So can we just take a minute and kind of talk through what this looks like? Because I've tried to explain this, especially to people who have never heard this argument before. And it almost seems like common sense. Like, of course I shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. Everyone knows that. And so can you help kind of understand that?
What's critical to understanding this argument is the distinction between objective and subjective. To say that something is objective means that it is valid and binding, independent of human opinion. To say that something is subjective means that it's just a matter of opinion, and therefore there can be different opinions on this. Now, the question is, are moral values objective or are they subjective? And the first premise says that if there is no God to serve as a transcendent anchor point or plumb line for moral values and duties, then everything becomes subjective. It's all relative to human societal conditioning and mores that people have developed. Moral values and duties would just be spin-offs of the evolutionary process and social conditioning, but they would have no objective binding validity in the absence of God. And then the second premise is that that's simply false. When you examine our moral experiences, you say, we know that to torture and rape a little child is morally wrong. This is not a morally indifferent act equivalent to loving and nurturing that child.
And so you would say, I think you've used this example quite a bit, is let's say that the Nazis won the war and they either brainwashed everyone or killed everyone that disagreed with their view on killing Jews, for example.
Right.
It doesn't matter if everyone in the world thought that that was a good thing to do. It's still morally evil because there seems to be this moral law that is above any society, above any opinion, above anyone's power that exists. And so we have to explain why that moral law exists. And the only explanation is because there's a moral lawgiver, God.
Yes, that would be it in a nutshell. And the illustration with the Holocaust and the Nazi victory was simply to illustrate the difference between objective and subjective. If moral values and duties are merely subjective, then might makes right. And if the Nazis had won and everybody agreed the Holocaust was good, well, then it would be good because it's just subjective. But if you think that it would still be morally reprehensible to do to Jewish people and homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses what the Third Reich did, then you will say that moral values and duties do exist objectively, and it's not just a matter of personal opinion.
Okay. And so just to clarify, what you're not talking about is you're not saying that if you believe or don't believe in God, you can't be a good person. It's does good and bad objectively exist with or without God is the clarification there.
That's absolutely correct. And this is one of the most important and prevalent misunderstandings of the argument. When you share this with an unbeliever, he thinks that you're saying that in order to be a good person, you've got to believe in God. And that is just false and irrelevant. The argument is not that in order for objective good to exist, you have to believe in God. It is that God has to exist in order for objective good and evil to exist. It's not about belief in God, it's about God. The next argument is the one from the possibility of God's existence to his reality. This is an argument called the ontological argument. And the idea here is that if it's possible that there is a God, then God actually does exist. This is the most philosophical and difficult of the arguments to understand.
It almost feels like a mental trick a little bit because
it feels like that, yes, but it really isn't. And a number of contemporary philosophers have defended this argument. The idea here is that God is the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. Now, what are the properties that a maximally great being would have to have? Well, he'd have to be omnipotent. He'd have to be omniscient. He'd have to be morally perfect. And he would have to exist in every possible world. All of those are great-making properties. So if it's possible that God exists, that means that there is a possible world in which there exists a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and exists in every possible world. Well, if he exists in every possible world, that means he exists in the actual world. And if he exists in the actual world, it follows that God exists. So if God's existence as a maximally great being is even possible, it follows logically that God does exist. And so the key premise in this argument is the first one. Is it possible that a maximally great being exists? The atheist has to say not merely that God does not exist, the atheist has to say that it's impossible that God exists. And so I like to simply leave this argument with my conversation partner. I say, do you think it's possible that God exists? If you do, then you should believe that God does exist.
To wrestle this one, I think you kind of have to be a philosopher, because I've heard this for years and I think it's great, but I think most people, like I've tried to explain it to, they just go, I don't even know what you're it's so confusing. So I love it, but we'll have to probably leave that to the more philosophically minded listeners.
Okay, different strokes for different folks.
Yeah, there you
but
go.
I have seen cases where people have come to faith in God through this argument.
Awesome. I love it, but I think probably our average listener may go, I'm not even sure what to do with it. So, okay, I would love to get to, because I know this is obviously super important, but an area of specialty for you is Jesus' resurrection. And then I had a couple follow-up questions for you.
All right. Well, if there is a transcendent, personal creator and designer of the universe who is the locus of absolute goodness, then the question is, has he revealed himself in some way in the world so that we can know him more closely? Or has he remained aloof and distant from the world that he has made? Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be the absolute revelation of this creator God. And he made radical personal claims whereby he put himself in the place of God. Claims to be the Messiah, the unique Son of God, the divine human Son of Man, prophesied by the Old Testament prophet Daniel. And these blasphemous claims eventually led to his crucifixion. What happened to Jesus after he died? Well, I think that the evidence supports the fact that Jesus was interred in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. That tomb was then found empty on the first day of the week following his crucifixion by a group of his female disciples. Thirdly, that different individuals and groups of people thereafter experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And finally, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite every predisposition to the contrary. Now, Cody, the remarkable thing is that those four facts represent the wide majority view of New Testament criticism today about the historical Jesus. I'm not talking about the opinion of conservative scholars or evangelical scholars. I'm talking about the broad mainstream of historical Jesus scholarship. So the question is, how do you best explain those facts? And I'm persuaded that the best explanation is the one that the original disciples gave, namely, God raised him from the dead. And the resurrection of Jesus takes on such significance because it vindicates those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. If this man has been raised from the dead, then the God that he had allegedly blasphemed has vindicated those claims publicly and dramatically.
So a couple of common objections I would hear to this is, well, one, we don't even know who wrote these. They're a couple thousand years old. Are we supposed to just believe some fairly like anonymous authors talking about this Jesus person who, if he existed, he did the one thing that no one has ever done, which is resurrect from the dead. So how do we trust what these people are saying, even though we don't even know them?
Yeah, the names of the people is really irrelevant. The author of the Gospel of Luke could have been named Herman or Jesse, for all we know. It doesn't matter. What matters is the proximity of these authors to the events that they relate. And in that sense, it's very misleading to say, oh, well, these things happened 2,000 years ago. The relevant time gap is not the gap between the records and today. The relevant time gap is the gap between the events and the records of those events. If that time gap is brief, then it doesn't matter how long the events and the records have receded into the past. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just due to the passage of time. And in the case of these New Testament documents, we have got extremely early, multiple attestation of the life and teachings of Jesus that have led New Testament scholars to agree on the credibility of those four facts. And these scholars are not at all necessarily committed to traditional authorship of those Gospels.
So, okay, I know we could spend another couple hours on this topic, and I would point people to your resources, which we'll be posting. Let me ask you a little bit more technical question on this. What do you do with passages where it not only talks about Jesus' resurrection, but it talks about the resurrection of other people at the same time? How do you wrestle with that?
This is in the Gospel of Matthew. And what's interesting about this is that the resurrection of these Old Testament saints is not connected to the narratives of Jesus' resurrection. It's connected to his crucifixion. So if you think that this story casts doubt on Matthew's credibility, it would cast doubt on his account of the crucifixion, not of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, that being said, even if you threw out the Gospel of Matthew, because Matthew you think is not credible, that really doesn't affect the evidence because it still leaves Mark, Luke, John, and the Apostle Paul. So it wouldn't affect the case that much, even if you took that radical step of throwing Matthew out. Now, finally, the question here, I think, too, is, well, did Matthew mean this literally or not? It could well be that this is written in the language of Jewish apocalyptic, to which I referred earlier with respect to the book of Revelation, such as when Jesus says at the time of his return, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven. These are ways of symbolizing the tremendous world difference-making significance of the event. And it could be that that's what Matthew is doing, that he's trying to show that the death of Jesus had literally earth-shattering significance. Okay. So it's not even clear if he means it to be literal. If he did mean it literally, well, it may be that Matthew had stories of certain appearances that took place in Jerusalem where people claimed that they had seen maybe Elijah or Moses or someone risen from the dead. And so Matthew reports the stories that he'd heard in Jerusalem. We just don't know enough about the background to this little incident.
Okay. Let me shift gears a little bit. Something maybe more practical that's on people's minds, which is the coronavirus. Is as we look at the world, a lot of people are asking the question, how does a good God allow something like this to happen? If he was powerful and he was good, he would stop this. This also plays into natural evil a little bit. And so sometimes we can understand, okay, I've made a bad choice and the consequences of my choice is this, but this seems to be something that is the byproduct of what's happening in nature. So how do we explain all of that?
Well, I do think that this is a great example or illustration of how natural and evil and moral evil become inextricably intertwined. If the intelligence reports are right, this virus resulted from the mishandling of the virus by a Chinese worker in that lab in Wuhan, and he took it home and gave it to his girlfriend that he was living with, and thence it spread. And the Chinese authorities tried to cover it up. and didn't report it accurately to the world, so that you have here an example of natural evil intertwined with moral evil and human free decisions. Now, I have a very strong view of divine sovereignty and God's providence over the world. And so I think that God does have a good reason for permitting this pandemic. But I don't consider myself to be in a position, given my location in time and space and my finitude, to be able to say definitively what God's reasons are for permitting the pandemic. They are doubtless multifarious and complex, and some of them may not emerge until hundreds of years from now. An event of this scope has world-changing significance. So we can't even imagine the ramifications that this event will have going forward in the future of humanity. And so we're simply not in a position to say with any confidence that it's improbable that God had morally sufficient reasons for allowing the pandemic to go forward.
So it kind of reminds me a little bit of, and one of the issues I wanted to bring up is you've put forward a theological view that might be different than what a lot of people have heard. So some people have heard of Calvinism, and some people have heard of Arminianism, but you come up with, or you have not come up with, you proposed a view called Molinism, which I'm a fan of. Can you explain what that is? Because that sort of touches on what you were just saying.
Molinism comes from a 16th century Catholic theologian named Luis Molina, and it combines the strong view of divine sovereignty that Calvinists hold to with the affirmation of human freedom that Arminians hold to. And it reconciles these two biblical truths in a dramatic way. And basically what it says is this, is that God, being omniscient, knows how any person he might create would freely choose in any set of circumstances God might place him in. So by choosing which persons to create and which circumstances to place them in, God sovereignly controls the course of history, yet without abridging human freedom. People are not puppets. God is not pulling the strings. He just knows how they would freely choose in any circumstances he might put them in. And therefore, he's able to direct the course of world history through the free decisions of human people.
And so does this answer the question of exclusivity, and not just exclusivity, but the problem of, I guess, the pagans is what it's oftentimes referred to, which is those people who haven't heard before. Does that sort of help answer those questions?
I think it does. This idea is one of the most fruitful theological ideas I have ever encountered, and it has multiple applications. And one area where I've tried to apply it is in this question of what about those who have never heard? What is their status? And what I argue there is that it's possible that God has so providentially arranged the world that anybody who would believe in Christ and be saved, if he heard of him, is created at a time and place in history where he does hear of him, so that no one is lost because of the accidents of history and geography.
Great. So let me touch on a couple more issues here. Areas of your specialty is you've been researching or just finished up a research project on Jesus' crucifixion and his kind of wrestling through what that meant. And so one of the questions that I get oftentimes is, why does Jesus have to die? Why can't he just forgive me? Why can't he just say, hey, you know what, you like a good parent is oftentimes what I hear is, if my kid felt bad about something, I would forgive them. There wouldn't be a penalty that would have to be paid.
Yes, that's right. And what is critical here is that we realize that God is not, so to speak, a private person. involved in a personal dispute. He is the moral ruler of the universe, absolutely holy and just. He is as just as he is loving and forgiving. And I would argue that neither his justice nor his love can be compromised, because these are essential attributes of God. And therefore, God is not free to simply blink at sin and say, okay, I forgive you. It doesn't matter, because then the justice of the moral universe governed by God would be disrupted and destroyed, and God would not be perfectly just. So I think God's own holiness and justice demands that every sin be punished, that every sin receive its just desert. And so the question is, who's going to pay that penalty? Is it going to be you and I, or will it be Christ? God has put Christ forward as what's called a penal substitute. That is to say, he vicariously bore the suffering that we deserved as the punishment for our sins, thereby satisfying divine justice and freeing up God's love and forgiveness for us to be reconciled to God.
Yeah. Recently, an atheist asked me, now, how can God, okay, so that's all good and that sounds fine, but are there certain things that cannot be forgiven or should not be forgiven? You know, these murderers and these rapists and all these people who, how is it that they can just ask for forgiveness for these heinous acts and then
Yes.
God just simply forgives them?
He doesn't simply forgive them. That's the point we were just making.
Right.
He exacts the punishment due for those crimes from Christ.
I think what they were
Jesus Christ pays that penalty.
I think what they're pointing out was all they have to do is repent, and then these evil, heinous deeds. Like, I think his sense of justice was so strong that those things should not be forgiven, and if they are, it can't be just through repentance. There has to be more.
Well, again, Cody, it's not just repentance and forgiveness. It is that the just desert for these crimes has been exacted. Someone has paid dearly the price for committing these crimes, and it is Jesus. So these crimes do not go unpunished. It's just that someone else bears them instead of the repentant criminal. And I would ask your atheist friend this: you really think that a loving God would refuse to forgive someone who is genuinely repentant of his crimes and is devastated with guilt because he's done that God would fold his arms and sit back and say, no way, I'm forgiving you. I'm going to get you for what you did. I think that's morally reprehensible. That's inconsistent with the love of God, just as blinking at sin is inconsistent with the justice of God. So the cross is so beautiful because it reconciles the love and the justice of God. They meet at the cross, the grace and the mercy of God and the holiness of God.
Okay, it looks like I've probably got time for one more question because I want to get you out here in under an hour. So this is more on a personal note, and I would love for you to share if you wouldn't mind. You may not remember this, but one of the days that I was in your class, you got up at the beginning of each morning and you would give a short devotional and then kind of a word of wisdom for the day. And I will never forget one of the days. You talked about how you never felt like you were the smartest kid in class, and that you never that you didn't have the natural talents that other kids did, but because of your persistence, you were able to continue to climb that academic ladder and learn and eventually get 2 PhDs and speak around the world. And that was a real big encouragement for me personally.
Good.
And, so, and you also shared about some of the I guess some of the setbacks that you had along the way in pursuing your academic career. And so maybe you could talk about what failure looks like or setbacks look like in the Christian worldview, and how you've wrestled with those.
Yeah. When I had my German oral examination in theology for my doctoral degree, my doctoral supervisor refused to meet with me to advise me about how to prepare for this exam. It was bizarre. He just didn't have time for me. And so I went to his assistant and said, how can I prepare for this exam? And he said, oh, forget about it. And I said, no way, man, I'm not that stupid. And he said, well, the professor only asks questions over his own writings. Just master those and you'll be all right. So in the weeks leading up to the exam, I read everything this man had ever written and thoroughly digested it. And I went into the exam and he started asking questions about the history of dogma that weren't covered in his writings. And I didn't know the answers. And again and again and again, I had to say, I don't know. It was the most humiliating and devastating experience I ever had in my life. And so I failed that exam and came back to the United States, not with my degree in hand, but as a failure. And as I reflected on that experience, I thought, how could God allow this to happen? We were praying for this exam. I knew I was in his will. We were walking in his will. He had miraculously provided us the money to do this doctorate in Germany. How could I fail? And what I came to see, Cody, was a radical new insight for me into the will of God. And that is that God's will for your life can include failure, and that God may lead you into failure. He has things to teach you through failure that you could never learn through success. And in my case, I had an opportunity to take the exam a year later. And boy, during that year, I did nothing but study for this exam. And when I went back to Munich a year later, I walked into the examination room. Everything looked just like it had before. But as the professor began to ask the questions, the answers just came smoothly and fluently and easily. And I passed with a magna cum laude. And what happened to me as a result of that failure and that year of intense study is that I learned more about systematic theology than I ever would have if I had passed that exam and gone on. It was because of that failure that I got training in the field of systematic theology that was far, far beyond anything that your average seminary graduate does here in the United States. And so I can honestly say that even though I would never want to go through that experience again, I am glad that I failed, because God had things to teach me through that failure that he has tremendously used in the years of ministry since.
That's awesome. Well, I want to personally thank you not only for the time that you spent with us today, but for me personally, is about 10 years ago, I was going through a crisis of faith. And it is by watching your videos and reading all of your books that not only affirmed my faith, but sent me into seminary so that I could learn more. And so I'm more than grateful for what you've done.
Praise the Lord. And now here you are pastoring a church.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much. And thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
God bless.